What a great audience. We're due to start at 11 o'clock and everyone's sitting waiting at 11 o'clock. What could go wrong, John? Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 UK Forestry Market Report, put together by Till Hill and Goldcrest. I'm your chair for today. I'm Mark Prentice. My day job is I'm a banker. I head up the banking team for Hamden & Co. And if you've not heard of us, we're a small but beautifully formed private bank based here in Charlotte Square in Edinburgh. We have clients who are here in the room today who invest in property and others who are thinking about investing in property. So we're delighted to support today's event. The format is we have 4 expert speakers who will come up and talk for about 15 to 20 minutes each. Isn't that right, gentlemen? Okay. And then they'll all come up afterwards and do a Q&A. So please keep your questions for the end, scribble some notes down, and I will come to you for the killer questions after they've done their piece. After the Q&A, we will then adjourn for some coffee and tea and some lunch. I have to say this has also been streamed live on YouTube. To the thousands of you at home, welcome. And please also fire in your questions. Keyboard warriors, please. And we'll come to your questions as well. I think that's enough from me now. Xander, are you ready to go? Xander Mahoney will start the briefings.
Thank you, Mark, and good morning, everyone. Oh, sorry, this isn't actually the right presentation. Sorry. There we go. I'd like to open this meeting of Sitkaholics Anonymous by admitting that I have a problem. Sitka looks best in my spreadsheets, so I cram as much of it as I can into every corner of every property. Am I alone? So the UK has been insulated from the worst of climate change so far, and our growing conditions might actually improve. But having all our eggs in one basket makes us vulnerable to risks, such as droughts, storms, pests, and diseases. But what's the best strategy? Is it to sacrifice productivity for diversity? Is it to focus on plant health to keep the pests at bay? Well, we're lucky today to have speakers on both forest diversity and the importance of silviculture. So someone once said to me about these presentations that they wish there was more analysis. So you're all going to pay for that today. Now, we thought there'd been a steady flow of multi-million-pound properties coming to market this year. Then we added them all up, and it said we were down by more than half. What gives? Well, if you remember last year, there was 2 properties alone that accounted for £150 million worth of value. So stripping them out and focusing on the more typical properties, we're actually up by 80%. And that trend has continued into the coming year with multiple large assets either on the market or, as we understand, imminently coming to market. Valuations then. So every year we have a view. We sit down, we chat, and we think, what's happened in the market? Then we collate the data and we scratch our heads. So this year, the view was quite confidently, market's kind of flat to slightly down, and then the data comes out at minus 18%. So the first thing we do is check the data, and it didn't actually take a lot of looking to see that the previous year there was a big deal done right before the mini budget, which is only just over 2 years ago now, that was done at a valuation 30% higher than anything else that year. This year, there was an island property done at a valuation of half the next cheapest property. So stripping those 2 out, and we're back to minus 8 point something, which my colleague Steve helpfully pointed out is still not flat to slightly down. So despite many painful days testing out different statistical methods, the data still wings around much more than what we observe in the market. We tried multi-year rolling averages, which is actually John's idea. And the challenge we had with that is it hides the turning points in the market. So, for example, the big run-up 2 years ago would still be telling us we were going up this year. We also tried weighted medians, which is a giant pain to implement in Excel. I spent days trying to figure it out, and it achieved nothing. So why is this? Well, we only trade less than 1% of the commercial forestry area, the privately owned commercial forestry area in the UK each year. So it's a very small sample. And within that sample, the individual assets have quite different valuations based on things like location, access, and species. So that's perhaps why we agents, and even this event, exist to help demystify some of this process of valuing forests. So a bunch of dots. Does that mean anything to anybody? No? Right, so what's going on here? So each dot is the valuation of a deal. So pounds per stocked hectare. So higher up means higher pounds per stocked hectare, more expensive stuff. Lower down, lower pounds per stocked hectare. And we've got a line for the current year, 2024, and a line for the previous year. So what can we see? We can see that they kind of bunch together in the middle, and then there's a few sticking out at either end. So I actually think it's easier to see what's happening if we just space the dots out. So same dots, just spaced out. So this pattern, I went back quite a few years. It's the same every single year, right? So is this a linear relationship with outliers? This is actually a third-order polynomial relationship. Big words, but if you remember, we just spaced the dots out, so the x-axis doesn't mean anything. But whatever's happening here, we can see that there's some deals that everybody goes mad for, and some deals that get left behind. It kind of reminds me of a box of chocolates at Christmas, and we all know which ones get left behind then. But what is interesting about this is, of the deals done this year, only 2 of them were at a higher valuation than the average from 2 years ago. I'll leave it to the statisticians to decide if that means there's been a statistically significant change in pricing. So what's the point in all this? Well, the data forces us to think, like this guy. Though I've never understood why these philosophers couldn't do their thinking with their clothes on. So what did this thinking lead us to? Well, we noticed there's also been a big shift, a big skew towards North Scotland properties this year. And we believe that's because with higher interest rates, investors are looking for near-term income. And a lot of the properties further south, where the trees grow faster, have already been harvested. And now we'd expect that these more mature properties would fetch a higher valuation. But these Northern Scotland properties are further from the core timber market. So actually still, as a group, the more mature North Scotland properties were still the lowest value region overall. And so that also has dragged down valuations. So between the outlier effect and the northern skew, we believe there's support for our assertion that like-for-like valuations are down by a mid-single-digit percentage at most. And what do you think was the biggest determinant of valuation, the most highly correlated variable? It was Sitka proportion. You're all bloody addicts. So jokes aside, not that got a laugh, if anyone is struggling with addiction, please do come talk to me, because addiction is not a joke. Land then. So we can't capture everything that happens in the land market, but it's clear that the availability of commercial afforestation opportunities in Scotland continues to shrink. And the regulatory and stakeholder environment continues to get more challenging. And that makes the huge blowout planting figures that were reported for the past year even more surprising. But I think we can see that pricing has stabilized. And John and I have quite different views on this, but this is about, this 10K a hectare is about where we see deals getting done on market, with off-market deals perhaps a shade lower. There's been a huge run-up in availability of opportunities in Wales, but a lot of these are small and expensive, and we're not spending 17 grand a hectare on land for forestry in Wales. There are some bigger opportunities, and they're much more attractively priced, but they're few and far between. So desire to diversify away from Scotland and Wales is also driving demand for England, in spite of the regulatory challenges there. And I haven't got a slide on this. The data's all in the report, but the headline figure is a little lower than Wales, but perhaps a little bit more realistic. demonstrating the affordability challenge south of the border. So this is the Gartner hype cycle, which is typically applied to new technologies. I think we've seen Bitcoin go through multiple of these cycles by now. I show it because I believe that for Woodland Carbon, we're in the trough of disillusionment, which sounds scary, but it's actually the second best time to invest. The best time is to get in at the ground floor and sell at the peak, but that's very difficult to achieve at both ends. But now is the time to buy and hold if you have conviction that Woodland Carbon has a part to play in the solution to climate change. When it comes to buying land for Woodland Carbon, it's not trivial to find inexpensive land that's suitable for natives for carbon, but not suitable for conifer. But when we do, we tend to pay a little bit less for it. It often means Scotland, but alternatives are possible as well. So that's it from me, and there's a few messages I want to leave you with. The first is that there's more opportunity to deploy capital into UK commercial forestry right now than at any point in the past decade. And pricing has clearly stabilized or prices probably come back a little bit since the pandemic highs. And afforestation continues to be a challenge, but expanding woodland cover is a worthy goal. Thank you.
The trough of disillusionment. Wow, who would have thought? Okay, thank you, Xander. John, are you next? From Goldcrest, John Lawton-Burt.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you all very much indeed for joining us here today. Having digested the results of this year's sales, I refreshed my memory of what I wrote 12 months ago. My initial reaction was that this year's presentation might be somewhat similar to last. But the more you analyse data, the more questions you start to ask oneself. One of the challenges we've had each year we produce this report is the data size, the number of annual sales. You've seen from Xander, it's very small. Some of you may be involved in commercial property investments. You might be familiar with the IPD index. The index tracks sales data for retail, commercial and office properties, providing total return figures on a monthly basis. The number of transactions of these assets literally run into thousands of deals each year, allowing a high degree of accurate comparison. Unfortunately, we don't have this luxury in the forestry market. So firstly, a friendly, call it a disclaimer. A property market is created when a willing seller and willing buyer come together and transact at a level they're both happy with. The majority of parties use a number of trusted advisors to understand the variables, discuss timeframes, and disposal acquisition strategy. The market data we at Goldcrest compile on a daily basis gives us an unrivaled insight into trends and the ability to understand market nuances, quality, quantity, location, carbon, distance to markets, and market aspirations. Mark Twain's quote, "Facts are stubborn things, but statistics are pliable," is never truer. So, before we dive off into the price variations created by these variables, an understanding of market sentiment is important. I wrote the majority of this presentation before the 30th of October, Budget Day, unaware of what changes might be announced and how they may or may not affect our market. I'll share my post-budget views a little later. Purchasers have been a little selective and a touch cautious. Perhaps mindful of the bull run that peaked in the spring of 22, investors' enthusiasm cooled somewhat, as we know, in 23, and 2024 has been similar. However, during the second half of August, September and early October, as we approached the budget, we completed on a large number of transactions as speculation from accounting commentators rose. It was a busy period. Yes, some potential purchasers were less decisive and decided to sit on their hands, and the overall number of inquiries was down. However, the market confirmed there is no shortage of cash out there in the system. However, whether forestry, other property asset classes, or indeed equities and gilts, parties transact less as confidence fades. So, with a new Labour government and concerns of a potential large-scale tax grab budget, it's not surprising that some purchasers were holding back a little. This was certainly the case with some ESG buyers, environmental, social and governance, where capital might have been the reason for holding back, rather than political reasons. Other influences, of course, have a combined accumulative effect on market pricing. As with most investments, considered in-depth analysis is required to ensure you get the full picture. Let's have a look at the fundamentals. Bank of England base rates have been quite settled around the 5% mark. Some investors appeared happy to sit on cash, but others admit this is not the best home from a tax perspective and see a land-based investment with the real physical growth of trees of 5 to 6% per annum over the life of the crop to be a good start. Combined with a strong expectation that timber prices will increase potentially substantially in the short to medium term, we have definitely seen a mature market, buying forest assets that are focused on growing timber, a global commodity in short supply, with taxation incentives being less of a driver. There is no doubt about it. Here in the UK, we grow extremely high-quality timber in a short period compared to many other producers. For much of the year, some of the institutional players who were voraciously hungry in 2021 and the first half of 2022 have found it harder to refill the piggy bank due to interest rates and investor hesitancy. When valuing properties for sale, purchase, family transfers, for lending institutions, funds or individuals, interest rates will of course have a bearing. Over the last 12 months, we have seen market discounted cash flows suggest returns of 6 to 10%, a healthy 1 to 5% above base rates. Location. In my mind, the forestry golden rectangle comprises North England and South Scotland. Productive upland sites with good ground and growing conditions, a large resource of competent forest managers and contractors, and crucially, easy access to established high-tech timber markets. In addition, we should add Mid Wales as a Premier Division location, where timber price often outperforms Scotland. This I refer to the Platinum Corner. In a Scottish context, values of like-for-like properties, of course, vary depending on a region. As a broad rule of thumb, after the golden rectangle, perhaps the Central Belt sits in second place. Aberdeenshire and Argyll probably third, and north of Inverness generally in fourth place. Yield class. I'm sure the vast majority of you here are familiar with the term, but for those of you who are not, yield class is the term we use to describe the volume of timber per tonne of growth each year per hectare for the life of the crop. In reality, this is not a straight line. Clearly, a young tree takes a while to get its toes in the ground and get happy, followed by a period of steady growth for approximately 20 years, then hopefully a serious growth spurt where the timber piles on the beef and significant height. I'm rather fond of this heat map on the screen. The darkest red representing the highest yield classes. Of course, owners and managers are trying to produce the highest yield classes with the highest percentage of green logs. But the dark red does not always translate into the most valuable sites due to influences by the other variables. However, I repeat, the UK grows wonderful timber, and the future value of this commodity should not be underestimated. That leads on to timber quality. Generally, in all property asset classes, good quality means you will always be able to get out. If something is cheap, there's usually a reason. It's a classic indicator. When rubbish is making a lot of money, you're probably close to or at the top of the market. It really doesn't take a math scholar to understand that if you have a mature crop standing at only 200 tonnes to the hectare with poor quality timber worth £30 a tonne, or a forest with high quality timber worth £60 a tonne standing at 600 tonnes to the hectare, the range in values of the two crops is £6,000 per hectare as opposed to £36,000 per hectare, plus the value of the land. Both sites will have taken 35 or 40 years to get there, but the higher quality crop is worth 600% more than the poor one. It's worth getting right. At the time of planting, it's critical that management has to be at its most focused for 3 or 4 years, and similarly at the time of timber marketing. Decision-making at these times can make or break the investment. So, to the marketplace and pricing. During the last 12 months, we have seen considerable variation in bid price for similar assets. We have transacted at figures akin to last year on many sales, but we are also aware of sales completing at figures which appear excellent buys, stroke somewhat cheap. I stress good professional advice is not expensive. With a small data set, you only need a handful of these low-value properties to slip through, which results in greatly distorted figures. This year, we have seen more low-value sales in remote locations distort figures. Distance to market may be considerable, quality sometimes poor, and access within PT sites and quality of country roads challenging. This has dragged down the overall pounds per hectare of forestry within the UK. Xander's given you the figures. We started with a discount of 18% on last year, but it is of course paramount that we compare like with like. After an adjustment, it appears values are down 8.8% on last year. We reached this figure after considerable analysis and debate. Personally, I believe this figure is still somewhat harsh. Poor marketing, possibly. Lower yield class, definitely. Some anxiety over new politician and Labour's first autumn budget, a factor. So, what's it all worth? Planting land values in the last 12 months have seen an incredible spread of values and variation. We've sold as high as just under £20,000 a hectare and seen deals quite a bit lower than £10,000 a hectare. The average, as the report states, comes out at something like £14,000 a hectare. Young crop sales have been few and far between, but show a spread of some £10,000 up to, again, nearly £20,000 a hectare. Carbon can create additional value to young crops. Trading of woodland carbon has become clearer and more commonly understood in the last 12 months, and purchasers generally have good visibility on market price. However, we need to get better at paying for the value of carbon while it is still attached to young crops and the land. Mid-rotation crops we've sold as low as £17,000 a hectare, at as high as approaching or at £30,000 a hectare. And lastly, the mature forests showing a spread from mid £20,000 a hectare to mid £30,000 a hectare. All of this showing the great variation and illustrating that no price fits all. So, where are we going? My words so far reflect the last 12 months, but no one listening will have missed the fact that it is less than 3 weeks since Rachel Reeves, our current Chancellor, delivered the first Labour budget for 14 years. £40 billion worth of tax increases. However you slice it, the British population is now poorer than it was pre-budget. In the forestry world, taxation was adjusted with a reduction in relief for business and agricultural property. Currently, if an individual owns a commercial forest and runs it as a business for 2 or more years, upon death there is no inheritance tax paid by the beneficiary. From April 2026, the first £1 million will remain inheritance tax-free, but then the relief has been reduced, resulting in 20% inheritance tax paid due on the balance. On first reading, this is disappointing. But name me another investment where IHT is free on the first £1 million and then only charged at 20% rather than 40% on the balance. Timber remains free of income tax and CGT. Already, we've seen an increase in inquiries from individuals looking for investments up to and a bit more than £1 million. Quality commercial woodlands and forests remain fundamentally highly attractive investments with tax-efficient advantages and addition. I do not believe the results of the budget will bring more properties to the market, but possibly, as stated, will result perhaps in more purchases, certainly at the lower end of the values. I'm quite intrigued to see how the next 14 months up to April 2026 might pan out. What I am confident in is the fundamentals. A land-based, tangible investment. They aren't making any more land. Growing a global commodity that is in short supply. A developing world which consumes more timber as living standards improve. A requirement for increased house building in the UK. We're told it's going to increase in England by 14% in 2025. A huge reliance on timber imports and current timber pricing, which to me looks remarkably inexpensive. Yes, capital values are back last year and this. The market has rebalanced. I believe there's value out there to be had. To me, the future looks robust, exciting. So do not wait to invest in forestry. Invest in forestry and wait. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. So the quote there was Platinum Corner. So Xander and John give this update every year, so it's giving you an idea of what the markets have been doing and a forward view. The theme of this year's conference is resilience. So Stuart's going to come up and talk about how you put crops in the ground that give you some resilience, and Dr. David Edwards will do the same. So Stuart, the floor is yours.
Morning. This is a real opportunity for me as a forester to stand up here and rant about the importance of silviculture. Something that actually at the core of what we do. The art of growing trees is an important subject, but this is only going to be a brief run over. The challenges that forestry and society face, I think this, it's more important now to understand the science behind growing trees than ever before. And that's why I'm going to talk about the art of silviculture very, very briefly. Oh, hang on, wrong way. That's better. It used to be easy. I'm sure many in this room will recognise similar sites to that. I think my esteemed colleague over there, you probably was responsible for this one, were you? Yeah, it used to be easy. You know, you fenced, you ploughed, you drained, you planted, you did a bit of maintenance, you shut the gate for 40 years, and Sitka is a very forgiving species. It will grow, and, you know, we planted wall-to-wall Sitka with a few broadleaves at the entrance for aesthetics. And that's what we were encouraged to do. You know, we were doing nothing wrong. It was a strategic reserve of timber. We needed more of it. We still need more of it. And, Sitka gave us what we wanted. It'll self-thin to a degree. It copes with a variety of conditions and yields the results. So that was then. And, you know, I think that's probably one of my first planting maps that I produced for a scheme out in Dumfriesshire. You know, it was easy in that respect. The regulation, you know, a few pages of handwritten documents, badly photocopied map, and approved with a brief meeting with the forest officer on site and approved in weeks or a few months. Now, in certain parts of the country, you have grants simply for starting the process for applying for grants. It's more complex. We're more focused now on better design, and rightly so. You know, the bad old days or good old days of wall-to-wall Sitka are gone. It's far more complex. You know, we're not allowed to just plant a monoculture at wall-to-wall anymore. And, you know, we are measured on the success with design and species diversity. But we have to work through layers of competing stakeholders, often with views directly opposed to the thought of trees going into the ground. Years to approval, and to be honest, now I supplement my forestry qualification with a degree in bureaucracy. Driving it, we have the UK Forest Standard. I'm sure most of you in this room are aware of that. We're into version 5 now. And that shapes most of our decisions within the forest. Increasing pressure, downward pressure on single species. So putting pressure on our wonderful species that I'm addicted to, like Zander. You know, no longer can we simply just plough, plant, drain, fertilise the hell out of it, spray the hell out of it, and walk away and expect a crop at the end of it. We have to incorporate diverse species, all perform differently to Sitka in many ways. You know, we were spoiled by having discovered the Ferrari before we invented the Model T Ford in the way of tree species for commercial forestry. Most other species require a little bit, if not far more, TLC to grow. And many won't tolerate the conditions that Sitka grows in and yield truly economic results. Early establishment is increasingly harder with some of these species, and maybe even a longer period of time to get established. And, so we've got to understand that. And we've got to better understand the sites we are dealing with. We have been pushed up the hill. Our sites are upland, predominantly in the commercial world. They're challenging. And a lot of these diverse species don't like to be stuck on a cold hill in Argyll. But even Sitka spruce, there's an opportunity within all of this to place our Sitka in a better position, to use what Sitka can do in a better way and increase the yields rather than planting yield class 8 Sitka spruce on a peat bog. So, on to the alternatives. As I've said, compared to Sitka spruce, alternatives are likely and almost certainly to be a compromise on productivity and as such the ultimate economics of the site. We're all guided to ESC, the Environmental Site Classification Tool. Very powerful tool, got a lot of heavyweight stuff behind the scenes, a lot of species all piled in there. And you put in, I won't teach how to success, but you put in a load of parameters in and it spits out a list, potentially of 30 suitable trees for that site. But that's confusing and frankly, can be quite unhelpful, especially when, particularly junior staff are looking in on it. It doesn't tell you about whether the tree is silviculturally compatible with another tree. It doesn't tell you the type of log material you're going to get out of it. It doesn't tell you whether it's actually going to grow straight and true. It just tells you that these trees can theoretically grow alongside your Sitka spruce. it doesn't tell you, it doesn't tell you that planting stocks of these species can be limited, expensive, and the genetics untested. So you're not necessarily getting what you think you're going to get. I've touched on the establishment. Sitka, you can pretty much plant and leave, and it will put up with a lot. Many species like the exposure, and to only truly succeed require better soils and than we perhaps are going to be inheriting or able to acquire for our use in forestry. The wonderful pests and diseases, and I should have added climate in there, we're all acutely aware of the challenge we face. And, you know, you could scare the living daylights out of yourself by looking at what's coming over the hill. But diversifying without thought is not an answer and can be like running around in a dark room trying not to bump into things. What is it you're trying to avoid? And on upland sites, the danger is that we seek to diversify and you plant trees that are stressed. And stressed and happy trees lead to greater vulnerabilities down the line. We've seen it in Europe. You can see what happens when a natural pest has the conditions to thrive. Large post-war plantings of Norway spruce in areas that were not ideally suited to spruce, and increasing drought stress and wind events has led to an explosion of a usually endemic pest. And we've seen it come over into the UK, into Norway spruce in the southeast of England. Stressed trees in an area that now, with hindsight, you wouldn't have planted those trees. We need to keep this pest out. We can't be complacent. But in my opinion, luckily, most of our Sitka spruce is growing in an area where it's best suited. It's in the west, it's in the wet. It's a healthy tree, it's a vibrant tree. It is a resilient tree, but we can't be complacent, I agree with that. But what Sitka is going to be challenged by, is a completely different topic to this today. Continuous cover forestry is often promoted as a nirvana that we as foresters should be trying to achieve. A diverse forest, diverse species, multi-age class, a wonderful ecosystem that creates everything that we want. But shaky economics aside, we don't have a Central European climate where often people look to and say, well, look, CCF and low-impact forestry works very well. We are inherently a windy country, and that makes CCF challenging, particularly with our main and dominant timber tree, Sitka spruce. It's shallow-rooted, and it's often on the poor, exposed, wet ground that will allow that to occur with all too much ease. Pine in the east of England is more resilient, it's deeper rooted, it tends to be on drier sites, but even that is vulnerable to catastrophic gales such as Arwen that come through from an unusual direction. As such, CCF is best practiced in a lowland environment. The State Forest has some good examples of it in the east of England where it's a more benign climate, but even they were hit by the gales of '87. Well-drained, free-rooting areas, often making broadleaf a better option, but even they, as I say, are no match to these extreme and increasing weather events that we like to experience. Thinning, a real passion of mine. I do believe in a good thinning. And it's going to be increasingly important to understand the need to intervene in an effective way, particularly with more diverse species. Sitka spruce is forgiving. You can plant, it will sort itself out and yield useful log. But even Sitka, on the right conditions, on the right site, would benefit from a good quality thinning. But many other species, the larch, pines, firs, they need to maintain a crown depth and density if they are going to grow successfully and yield log material. You simply cannot plant Douglas fir at 2,700 stems a hectare, leave it for 40 years and hope to come back and have a quality crop at the end of it. So planning is absolutely crucial. You know, your diverse species need to be in a place that allows for the appropriate silviculture prescriptions to be carried out in a timely manner. If you leave things and simply just go in and do a rack thinning, which you often see in Sitka spruce, a lot of these species will not succeed. You'll end up with a load of chipwood at the end of it, and if it's log material you're wanting, forget it. And you know, your peaty wet grounds. And if you're standing in Argyll and you can see Island in the distance, I would again suggest that thinning is not an option. With our established forests, we're coming into the second and third rotation. And that gives us the opportunity to look at what has gone before, look at the crop. Not every corner of the forest has grown the best crops. So design and remapping of the productive areas to maximise the potential, both from an improved Sitka. You know, we have made some great strides through with our Sitka spruce breeding programs, VP, that can yield significantly more volume in a shorter time on less ground. So we can sweat the ground that we're having to plant our Sitka in far more. But other species do require careful placement. They're not as forgiving, and as I've said before, a stressed tree is a vulnerable tree. We have the opportunity to create more open ground, LTR, the bogland, all the low yielding stuff. We can incorporate it into a better designed forest and learn from our past mistakes. I put hang on, we'll go back again. Keep pressing the wrong one. I put productive broadleaf up on there. In upland context, there's no such thing as a productive broadleaf. That's all I've got to say on that. Carbon. Xander touched on it. We are in the, I can't think of what it was. What was the trough of disillusion? I spent most of my career in that, I think, so one day I'll get out of it. The model suits native broadleaf in a low or non-intervention model. Very dangerous from a silvicultural point of view. All trees, especially broadleaves, require good, sound silvicultural management if you're going to yield a timber crop at the end of it. Simply taking the carbon, stripping the F value out of it, leaving a poorly managed, poorly stocked broadleaf crop at the end of the 60, 100-year contract that you have with the carbon, leaves an unsustainable forest in its wake, and a wood that doesn't pay doesn't stay. Your future generations will look on with disbelief at that type of model. So, and commercial conifer is severely disadvantaged in the model. It assumes at the end of a commercial conifer's life that the carbon that's been accumulated, that goes into all our wonderful built environment, somehow disappears, and therefore we can't recognise it. And there's a definite non-intervention emphasis on the model. So it's a real challenge. If we're going to grow good carbon woodlands, maintenance, protection and management of the crop is essential to ensure a long-term future for that particular woodland. My closing thoughts you'll be glad to hear. Put a little red squirrel up there. They've enjoyed our mass planting of the last few decades. It's everybody loves to see a red squirrel, but don't understand that without some of our beautiful wall-to-wall Sitka, they wouldn't be there. We shouldn't be ashamed of what we've achieved, and we have learned from our mistakes. The modern forest is a different place, despite what everybody else would have you believe, especially the mainstream press. We're not allowed, nor do we want to, just put a square block on the hillside anymore. We want people to have the benefits of forestry, but there is still a need for timber, and we have to uphold that as a core principle to why we seek to grow trees. Sitka is a resilient species, and we really have an opportunity to further breed in resilience, both from pest, disease, and drought. And our sister nursery at Mailer are at the forefront of that sort of thing. And it's well worth a visit if you're ever down that way. Go in and look and see what they're doing with regards to not just Sitka, but other diverse species as well. You know, we are developing the capabilities of alternative species and trying to pick a breeding program up that brings other species up to the level where we see Sitka. But unlike an agricultural crop, it all takes time. And even with the best science, it still takes years to achieve what a wheat crop could be doing in half a dozen years. Simply put, we need to understand the silviculture if we're going to succeed. Oh, there we go.
Thank you, Stuart. I think deliberately provocative, and hopefully that's going to generate some questions, both online and in the audience. Our final speaker is a scientist. So Dr. David Edwards is going to come and talk about the science behind some of these trees. David.
So good morning, everybody. So my name's David Edwards. I work at Forest Research. I'm sure you've heard what Forest Research is. It's the research agency of the Forestry Commission. And I work in the Chief Scientist's office. So my job is to try and coordinate and support all our knowledge exchange. In other words, our engagement with the outside world, especially with policymakers, to make sure that all our research is useful to them because they're paying for most of it, but also with practitioners more broadly. So it's a great opportunity today to meet some of you from the wider sector and to present some of the work we've been doing. So the piece of work that I'm going to talk about today, as you can see in the subheading here, it's about selecting a short list of productive species for Scotland. So this is a piece of work that was commissioned by Scottish Forestry, in particular by Helen Sellers, who's in the audience here today. Helen leads on sustainable forest management policy. And it's a work that was to pull together the evidence base so that we can select a short list of productive species that the whole sector can hopefully buy into. Now, this would be a list that would then inform all kinds of further decisions. For example, which species should we focus on to ensure that we've got plant and seed supply? Which species should be fed into tree breeding programs so that we can improve the quality of the timber at the end of it all? Which species, for example, should we find out more about the silviculture so that we can be sure we know how to grow them in mixes or in different kinds of sites? But most importantly, which species are good in terms of timber and the end use and have markets? So we were asked to go away and assess a long list of species against various criteria and try and help develop that short list. So that's what I'm going to present on today. But by way of background, we've already heard a lot of this by Stuart in the previous presentation. We all know forests have many benefits. We also all know that forests have many, many risks, and they're under threat from a range of problems which appear to be increasing in frequency, severity, and also predictability due to climate change. And so we need to increase our ability to resist, adapt, respond, and recover. In other words, we just need to make sure that our forests are more resilient. How do we do that? Well, there are a range of measures, and most or all of these would be familiar to you all, I'm sure. What I'm going to focus on today is increasing species diversity. But in addition to that, we can increase the species that we use within a given stand. We can increase the structural diversity of our forests. Sometimes we can use natural regeneration to unleash the adaptive potential of tree populations so that they can adapt better to climate change. We can increase the range of provenances we use so that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket, and various other interventions to do with contingency planning and thinning and so on. And all this is set out very nicely in a document that I really want to recommend to you, the so-called Adaptation Practice Guide, which you may already have come across. So this was published by Forest Research a couple of years ago, and it's a very nice, clear statement of all the different measures that we recommend would be followed to address those risks that I showed in the previous slide. So please do take a look at that. It's available on this here. This is the Climate Change Hub that Forest Research has developed to try and bring together and curate all the evidence and advice on climate change adaptation and mitigation so that it's all available in one place. So please do have a look at that if you haven't already. Meanwhile, resilience features very strongly in the Scottish Forestry Strategy. A couple of years ago, Helen developed or wrote a paper for the Scottish National Forestry Stakeholder Group, setting out Scottish Forestry's approach to resilience and how they define resilience. After that, a steering group was set up, which has cross-sector representation. There's several people in the room here, I think, who are on that group. And that group is overseeing the work that Scottish Forestry is doing on resilience, and in particular, the development of an action plan, a strategic action plan, which sets out what Scottish Forestry will be doing. And that focuses on these three priorities that you can see here. Planning, we've heard about that from Stuart already, the importance of planning in ensuring that we get this right. Knowledge exchange, to make sure the sector knows all it can so that it can act and make its forests more resilient. And finally, species choice and silviculture. Now that last one there is the one that I'm going to focus on today. And in particular, the key action that the steering group has identified, which is to develop this short list of productive species. So I'm going to give a lightning tour of what that project is trying to do, and then show you. I won't be able to show you the short list, unfortunately, but I'm going to focus on the method that we've been pursuing to actually get there. So a year ago, Scottish Forestry gave us in Forest Research a long list of 64 species that we collectively agreed would be worth assessing. On the left-hand side, you can see a group of what's known as principal species, which are well used already in forestry. And you'll recognize all of those species, I'm sure. Also, we assessed some so-called secondary species, which are slightly less well-known, but still have strong potential. A few extra natives were added to the list, which didn't already appear on the previous slide. Plus, we were testing out a few so-called plot stage species, which, as the name suggests, have only been tried out in plots in Britain, but seem to show potential and were worth assessing as well. So that was the long list of 64 species that we were asked to assess. Then the question is, well, how do we assess them? What are the criteria we're going to use to assess these species? So we had a workshop organised by Scottish Forestry in September last year, and I think maybe some of you were at that workshop. And that was an opportunity to ask the sector which criteria mattered. So we got lots of feedback. We simplified that list of criteria and came up with these 8 here. So that's tree improvement, plant and seed supply, silviculture, site and climate suitability, productivity, of course, tree health, of course, also biodiversity and environmental impacts, because, not surprisingly, there are many interests who are concerned about that. And finally, timber properties and end use. So those were the criteria that we were asked to assess those species against. And what I'm going to do over the next 5 minutes is just run through each of those very quickly to give you a flavour of what we actually measured and what we didn't measure. So starting with tree improvement, our head of tree breeding and forest research, Richard Whitted, assessed all those species against all those criteria that you see there, provenance information, and the feasibility of selection, testing, and breeding, the effectiveness of mass deployment, and also the impact of all that in terms of benefits, ultimately in terms of income. Now, to do that properly, we had to separate out species which were either suited to an extensive approach or an intensive approach. So the extensive ones are those where really the next steps in tree improvement are fairly basic. They're like registering seed stands and just improving the provenance and ultimately creating orchards with plus trees. But there are also species where we know we're ready for an intensive approach, where there's a full tree breeding program is suitable, although very expensive. So all that was put together to score each of those species on the long list. And a quick sight of what came out of that, you can see at the very top those two purple dots. That's Sitka and Scots pine. No surprises, perhaps, that those are the two that had the greatest potential. Even now, despite many, many decades of improvement for Sitka, there's still potential improvement to be had. But also lots of other species which are slightly further down the list, which also have potential. The next criteria was plant and seed supply, because it would be pretty risky to roll out some of these species and grow them at scale in Scotland if we don't have good seed supply. So we assessed that with an external consultant who was very familiar with the overall sector. And we also assessed all those attributes that you see further down, which relate to the seed itself, but also to the nursery process, to see whether there are any risks or problems or extra costs that needed to be taken into account. So we ended up with a set of scores. On the whole, most species did well, and we got the impression that actually this shouldn't hold things up. If we decided that we were going to focus on certain species and put them on the short list, the nursery sector, it seems, could probably respond in most cases quite effectively. Now, the third criteria was silviculture, and the first significant attribute that we thought we should measure is how much do we know about them? Because, again, it would be risky to grow any of those species at scale if we just don't know much about them. So we used a measure of silvicultural knowledge to score each of the species. And we also collected data on the establishment rate, because that's a key variable that ultimately affects the return that you'll get on your investment. We also assembled all the data that we could on those attributes at the bottom that you can see: shade tolerance, natural regeneration, palatability from deer, and squirrel damage. Now, those attributes, we called them supporting attributes because we just sort of held that in the background as additional evidence, ultimately, so that we can look at our shortlist at the end and say, does that look sensible? Let's have a look at the supporting attributes and see whether we've got the right balance of species that can cope with a full range of silvicultural systems and site types that we're likely to need. Fourthly, site and climate suitability. So this is trying to answer the question, does the tree actually grow in Scotland? And some species, such as Sitka, and rather lesser known species, including, for example, Macedonian pine, are, as you well know for Sitka, able to be grown in a very large proportion of Scotland, and that is likely to be the case in the future as well. Other species, such as Douglas fir, are rather more fussy about the sites where they grow well, and that's again likely to be the case now and in the future. But if you look at changes over time, it appears that some species are going to increase in the area where they're suited, and some species are going to decrease due to various limiting factors. So it appears that grand fir, for example, is going to increase in the area where it's suited. And it appears that noble fir is going to decrease. So that's one way that we can sort of have a look at the shortlist and sort of help decide whether some species should be on it or not on it. And we also assess at the bottom, you can see frost, drought, wind damage, and fire as well. Productivity, we've heard about yield class from Stuart, obviously very important. So we've assessed the yield class on a simple scale from 1 to 4 and added that to the assessment as well. We also looked at carbon, how much carbon would be sequestered by each of the species, both in the tree and in the soil, and off-site as well. Tree health, we looked at the pest and pathogen risks both now and in the future, and scored that for every single species. Identifying, not surprisingly, that ash and larch have problems, and we should be thinking very carefully if we're going to include those on the short list. But also, quite significantly, a lot of the exotic pines were considered risky because of the risk of bringing in Dophistroma that might affect the Scots pine in Scotland, and one or two other species as well, such as Lawson cypress. Biodiversity. So what we did here is respond to a policy need to provide a measure that assesses what's called woodland ecological condition. So we looked at those 5 attributes there: nativeness, natural regeneration potential, how much shade they cast, because that's really important in terms of how much ground flora can survive. Phenology, that basically means whether it's broadleaf or conifer, deciduous or evergreen, rather, and also the maximum age. And we also looked to see whether any of the species had particularly negative environmental impacts. So eucalypts, for example, was flagged up with that problem due to the amount of water that it sucks up, and other issues as well. Finally, certainly not least, wood properties. Now, there are 2 slides to cover this because it was an important piece of the analysis that we've done, and it's still under development. But we worked with Dan Ridley-Ellis, who I think many of you will know. He's from Napier University. He prepared this extraordinary spreadsheet of properties of every species on our list, plus many more, with scores which were summarized into 2 different scores. Firstly, the technical potential. So looking at the wood, what potential does it have? Now, if you look at how that technical potential score is comprised, it includes various attributes, and we discussed these with lots of people in the sector, some of whom are in the room today. It includes what's called a minimum Sitka index. In other words, how similar is the wood to Sitka, which is a useful thing, I think, for us all to pay attention to. And the other measure was whether there's any markets for it, the current compatibility with the wood value chain. And that took into account a whole range of factors that you see listed there, including whether or not we're likely to be able to do strength grading in this country. So that is the full range of attributes that we assessed, and you can see on the left-hand side, those are the 8 criteria that I showed you at the beginning. In the middle are what we've called the definitive attributes. These are the ones that we've scored, quantified, and we've put them all on a scale from 1 to 4 so that we can compare them all. And as I say, various supporting attributes, which are sort of additional information to back up our choice when we get to that point. So what we have then, if you can imagine a matrix, you've got that long list of species down one side, and you've got the 8 criteria, or rather the 10 attributes along the top. And so for the last couple of slides, I just wanted to show you what that looks like when you put it all into a big spreadsheet. So here we go. This is just the top part of a very long spreadsheet. And down the left-hand side, you've got the first 20 or so species on the list. And across the top, you've got the attributes. And they're all scored on a scale from 1 to 4. And you see where it says weighting in the top left, and those numbers 1 all along the top. That is what happens if you weight each of those attributes equally. And you don't, for example, say that productivity or yield class is more important than any other. You just assume they're all of equal value. And if you do that, you get this list of species on the left-hand side with Sitka at the top, silver birch, Scots pine, western hemlock, and so on. Now, the key thing I want to say here is that there's no right answer. There's no top species. There's no fixed sort of list of priority species. It all depends on the weightings that you use. If you were to value 1 or 2 of those attributes more than others, then it will change the priority list. And I'm going to just quickly illustrate that. So first, though, that's the same spreadsheet a little bit further down the list, just to show that it goes right down, ultimately to 64 species. But if you were to weight it differently, if you were to say yield class or productivity is so important, I'm going to give that a weighting of 10, you get a slightly different list than you did before. Sitka still stays at the top, but then you get Norway spruce, Leyland cypress, grand fir, and so on. If you were to say that what really matters is pests and diseases, and you put that at 10, you get a very different list. And Sitka's way down as a result of that. And various safer, probably native, unfortunately not always productive species are the ones that prevail. So it's a tool to help sort of explore the data and to think it through and to think about the objectives that you have for forestry and to help try and identify the short list. And as I say, there are loads of so-called secondary attributes as well in the spreadsheet that help us think through, make sure that the short list of species that's emerging is suited to a whole range of silvicultural systems and site types, and would grow well in sites where Sitka currently grows, but also other species that would grow well on the east coast where things are predicted to be more drier, for example. So the key thing now is we've developed this tool, we can explore it in the way I've described, we can look at what sort of stays at the top of the list despite the different weightings that you put in. But we need to then use that to develop a short list, and that's what we're doing very closely with Scottish Forestry and a number of other stakeholders, and in particular with the steering group that's overseeing it all, to try and identify what that short list should be. Now, unfortunately, I can't show the final list because that's still in development, and all I've done here is to outline the method, but it's still an opportunity to get feedback from you and from others to hear what you think about this and whether there's anything that we've missed and that we should also take into account. But ultimately, over the next few weeks, we're going to probably begin to firm up what that list looks like. And there won't be many surprises in the top half a dozen or so. What's interesting are the ones a bit further down the list, where we've got quite a difficult decision to make, for example, between some of the firs. Which are the firs that we should be growing and which are the ones which are a little bit more risky? That's where I think the focus of attention needs to be. So that's my talk. It's not just my work. There's a good 30 people across Forest Research who have been involved in this, who are listed there, plus 1 or 2 key folk externally. At the bottom, I've just mentioned stakeholders, but there have been 2 workshops to explore this with stakeholders from across the sector. I'd say a good 70 or 80 different people have been involved from the sector, as well as Scottish Forestry, of course, who have funded it, overseen it, and have been incredibly good at helping us develop this together so that it meets their needs. So real thanks to all of you who have been involved, and especially to Scottish Forestry for making it happen. Okay, thank you.
So thank you, David. Can I ask the other presenters, please, to come up and sit in the hot seats to take the questions? And Dr. Sellers, do you want to join us as well? There might be some technical questions. Where is she? You coming? Come on. Because these guys are not going to answer anything too technical.
It's not the technical for me, I think, it's the party.
So that the format there says, can you please put your hands up and wait for the microphone to come, please? Because the live streaming means that people on the online won't hear it if you speak without the microphone. Panellists, there are 2 microphones to share, so grab it when it gets your turn, and we'll off we go. So, do I have the first hand, the first question? Shy audience. Harry, down the front here, please.
I actually had 2 questions, and probably one's more controversial than the other, so I'll keep the controversial one till later if you've got a thin audience not asking many questions. First up, looking at the last paper that you delivered, I was interested to notice in the productivity assessment, there was no mention in there of birch, of silver birch, and yet in the final metrics on an unweighted basis, that was coming out scoring really quite high. Just when we're looking at species diversification and what future woodland looks like, am I misinterpreting that, or is there something behind that, or as an industry, is that something that we need to look at more going forward?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. So silver birch productivity is well lower than most of the productive conifers. I think that's very clear. But if you then put it in that matrix and give productivity equal weighting to all those other things, it does well across many of those attributes, and that pushes it up the list. But you have to then look at that list and say which of those attributes matter most. And I think most, if not everyone in this room, would agree that productivity is pretty important, and also timber quality and end use is pretty important. And maybe site suitability is really important, and perhaps also pests and diseases. So you can begin to sort of identify some of those attributes and say, right, we're going to put the weightings right up for those, and that will push silver birch down.
Probably misstating in terms of my interpretation of the paper. It was more your final attribute in terms of its end use, and the use of birch didn't appear there at all, unless I'm misinterpreting that, and yet it scored very highly at the end. So as an individual product, is this something that we should be looking?
I see. Sorry.
Is that an industry failing? Is it if it does well, why aren't we using more of it?
You mean, why aren't we using it more for timber, you're saying? Yeah. I think actually there are probably people in the room here who would answer that better than me, who know all about the processing and marketing of silver birch. But it seems to me that it is a species with great potential as a productive species. So I think it ought to be in the shortlist personally, and hopefully that's what the data is showing.
Try harder and use more of it.
For the right objectives on the right sites, I guess.
Sure, I can feel you twitching there.
Yeah, I mean, silver birch has some real potential, and certainly our Scandinavian brothers put birch to very good use as a productive broadleaf, particularly in the high-grade plywood market. We don't have that in the UK as an industry, but there's some real potential. As a productive broadleaf, birch has a real potential to grow some very good quality, quick turnaround broadleaf material. At the moment, it's limited to kind of chip and firewood markets, but you know, you can get a 30-year rotation of birch on a site that makes very good high quality firewood. But yes, some real potential that, you know, for development, but yes, the sort of high quality end use for birch isn't there at the moment. We could perhaps export to Scandinavia.
As I understand it, and this might not be an indicator of quality, but don't IKEA use a lot of birch?
Yes, they do.
I mean, you might call that the eventual firewood market.
Yeah. No, I mean, you know, they you know, being a Scandinavian country, you know, they have access to that high quality birch ply material, and there's some fantastic stands. If you go over to Sweden and Finland, they really are streets ahead on their breeding program for birch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really what I'm referring to. And, you know, as an industry, we're being pushed to diversify. We're being pushed towards broadleaves. Surely this is one that we should look to model what the Finns are doing.
Yeah, I'll have a word with our shareholder, see whether they're prepared to build a play mill in the... Harry? No, I'm going to shake her head. No.
So my understanding also is that one of the panelists here who will remain nameless illegally imported and improved birch from Scandinavia and planted it in Lincolnshire, and as I understand, it's doing quite well.
Allegedly, my friend's birch is growing incredibly well. Very great apical dominance and growth.
Maybe we can plant up the fens next as the...
Yeah, that's it.
So, Harry, both your questions, have you still got your controversial one you want to use?
I'll keep the controversial one in the locker.
Okay, then. Any other hands? Sorry, you have to go to the back of the room, I'm afraid.
Thank you. I think it's maybe a timely question. Interesting to see the phraseology if we're in the trough of disillusionment for carbon. I think there are plenty of farmers who are also in a trough of disillusionment at the moment. I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on whether the growth in the carbon sector will sustain the current potential farm market or land market, or whether they anticipate there'll be a sort of a significant realignment across the UK in a post-budget society.
Xander, I have one for you to start with.
I'll start. Thanks, Anthony. So there's a few questions in there about carbon, the farmland market, and what was the third one, sorry?
Well, just whether we think that the recovery of the carbon, hopefully the growth or recovery of the carbon market will come at an opportune time to bolster land prices or to take advantage of those land prices, really.
Yeah, okay. So carbon, you know, it's not trivial, as it turns out, to kind of have carbon as a market. You know, it's not I don't think it's easy to sell to people, and my colleague David from our Carbon Store team will probably have stronger views on this. But I think this is why we're in this trough right now, because we're figuring out the hard bits, right? We're figuring out how do you transfer carbon from a landowner to potentially someone who needs to use that to offset their own emissions, and how does that legal contract work? And I can't see them, but I think there's a couple of solicitors in the room who've had some thoughts on this as well, and that I think will, you know, make it a lot more kind of a fungible, easy to transact, something that people can get their heads around. The challenge right now is I think that, you know, from a world we were in where interest rates were zero and long-term projects were easy and brands were looking for ways to differentiate themselves. You know, something like woodland carbon, biodiversity, all of these things were very appealing to companies. And now actually someone like Unilever, who have been at the front of the ESG movement, and they bought Ben & Jerry's, who have also been a very outspoken brand. And now Ben & Jerry's don't want to, for example, sell ice cream in the occupied West Bank, right, in Israel. And Unilever are like, you know, this isn't going to work for shareholders. You know, we're in a new world where everything can be political. A big company can't necessarily afford to take these viewpoints, right? So carbon, I think, and ESG has got caught up in a very political side of things, but also it's just harder for companies to justify when they're focusing on margins with cost inflation and higher costs of capital and such. But there's two factors in this. One is that the climate change is getting worse, not better. I had the misfortune of being in Valencia a few weeks ago, and the images from the news don't do it justice. It was apocalyptic. I've never seen anything like it. And so that's going to start coming back into people's minds. You know, it's just a foregone conclusion that people will be thinking more about carbon in the future. And trees can't solve all the problems unless we had like 5 planets to cover with trees. But they're part of the solution. And so my approach is just to say to as many people as possible, don't wait to think about it. I mean, this was, John made his point about don't wait to invest in forestry. You can't wait to kind of start planting trees for carbon, because we're 15 years from meaningful carbon sequestration from trees planted today, right? So that already puts us to 2040, right? So we've got, a decade for people to be thinking about 2050 targets? We've already missed 2030 targets, and people are having to use things like peatland that generate credits quicker. So that demand is going to come, and forward-thinking people are getting in there and doing it now, and will probably look both like heroes and make out like bandits from having done that ahead of the game. And I'm conscious I've rattled on for a lot there, so I'll say a very brief thing to your farmland question before I hand over to folks who might have more views. But it's become more challenging for farm owners, right? The walls have closed in a little bit. I think there'll possibly be a movement towards the institutionalization of higher grade farmland in the UK. And for lower grade farmland, I think it gets more challenging to justify an asset that basically makes no money, but is worth huge amounts of money as an asset, if you're not getting the same level of inheritance tax benefits and such. Because if you're going to get 20% back from HMRC, have you missed out on decades of returns in tech stocks, for example, which actually, if you've 10x'd your money, you're fine paying 40% on that, right? I'll shut up now.
John, you could talk about the value in carbon.
I think it comes down to demand and supply. If we look at our friends in the farming world today outside Downing Street, they've got a lot to say. However, sheep and cattle are at a 10-year all-time high. Why is that? We're not suddenly eating a lot more meat. We're eating similar amounts, even though there's a few more vegans about. But it's there because we're producing less beef, and so the price has gone up. Will we see carbon farmers continue to compete with the farming market? I believe so. If you look at the value of the trees and the value of the carbon, then they will outperform the farmers. And that won't change. We need food, we need more timber, but it's a balance of market supply. Will we see more land come as a result of this last budget? Personally, I don't think a great deal. Farmers are pretty hardy and resilient, and will they, when they sell, invariably, someone's died, so yes, we're looking at inheritance tax, but also debt and divorce have always been the 3 things that drive land sales. And I can't see that changing. Will we see a huge amount of additional land come? I don't think so.
Thank you. I better take an online question. I can see you waving furiously.
Yeah, so in relation to David's presentation, when will the shortlist be available, and how applicable is the Scottish research to Wales?
Thanks for that one. So I guess the key thing to say with this species choice works, firstly, what an excellent job that Forest Research has been doing, and also how important it's been to work cross-sector, and with the 2 workshops that we've had to pull in, the expertise from across the sector in terms of what those criteria are going to be and what we're going to consider when we choose these shortlists for the future. So that has been one of our key priorities really for this work, and I think has worked quite effectively. And also we have cross-sector representation on our steering group, which is also going to be the ones that ultimately decide and sign off on this list. And we're actually hoping to do that in the next 2 or 3 months. We've got a meeting coming up in December where we'll discuss the list and the results, and then there'll be an opportunity for the steering group to go away, speak to colleagues, and we'll come back and decide the final list hopefully sometime in the new year. In terms of working with the other countries, that's something that we're actively doing. They're extremely interested in this work. Both colleagues in England and also in Wales are very interested in the work that David and his colleagues across Forest Research are doing. And we have a coordination group set up at UK level to discuss, given that resilience and species choice particularly is such an important issue, as well as forest genetic resources for the future. We have a cross-sector UK group that's set up to look at that. I know that Wales are actively looking to develop this work and develop their own list for Wales, and England are looking to do the same. So we're looking to work with them, make this work available to them, and so ultimately we can share understanding on that. Thanks. Anything you want to add?
Just very quickly to add to that, I think when you think about how this list will be used, some of the actions that will follow are actually probably better done at GB level or UK level. For example, identifying species for tree breeding programs, that's best done at a GB level. Also, plant and seed supply, that's really a GB level issue rather than one that's focusing just on one particular country. So there's real value in coordinating the work across all 3 countries, if not also Northern Ireland, and making sure that we're all can see the common list of species that every country is interested in promoting.
Thank you very much. Back in the room, towards back there.
Thanks. Hi, Hannah Wheatley from the Scottish Land Commission. Every year we publish a rural land market report where we analyse registers of Scotland, sales data for Scotland, and we use industry reports to triangulate our findings. So thanks, we use yours a lot. My question is around transparency. We've noticed a kind of increase in the use of guide price and offers over, and also we're wondering whether there's been an increase or a change in on and off market sales, and whether that relates to sort of speculation around natural capital. I was wondering if you could speak to that, and also if you've got a kind of average percentage over guide price that you could share.
So John, I think she's trying to do your job for you, but so tell us the art of valuation. It's okay, it's on.
It's on. Guide pricing is part of the marketing approach, and one needs to gauge where the market is, if it's absolutely flying along, if it's a bit quieter, and it's a very delicate touch. If we compare Scotland to England, traditionally south of the border we have a guide price. And if you're wanting to achieve £100,000 for a property, you might suggest that the guide price is £100,000 or just a little bit more. And I first started my career south of the border and experienced that. Here north of the border, the guide price, we tend to seek offers over. And one of the first questions a new buyer might ask is, how much over do I need to bid? So that then comes down to really the ability of the selling agent. We are instructed to get the best possible price for the owner of the property, and that's our job. So there is a bit of, dare I say it, a black art in that. We wouldn't necessarily give a straight answer, and when the market is very hot, if we go back 3 or 4 years, we saw some incredibly high percentages over the guide price. And some people might say, well, Lambert, do you know what you're talking about? It was a credible period of amount of cash in the system and strong bidding. We come back and the market has quietened off in the last 2 years. So all of that it's a very subtle change. And there's been probably more transactions this year which have been by direct negotiation. Now, that clearly just reflects the state of the market. And I think it's not one fits all. And again, that just comes down to marketing and trying to ensure that we're doing a good job for our clients. I
think I can answer 2 of the questions. I agree with everything John said. So we probably do have an average over guide. We don't publish it, but if you send me an email, I can probably dig that out of the numbers for you. By natural capital, do you mean sort of non-commercial forestry transactions?
I saw, yeah, yes, thanks.
Yeah, I'd say that market's been quite quiet. There's been folks trying to raise money to do that who've found it challenging. So yeah, that market was bananas in the pandemic and has not been like that since. And then in terms of on-market versus off-market, John might have some thoughts on this as well. We see a lot of the deals that happen in forestry, so an existing commercial forest, and often the seller is a descendant of the original purchaser who feels less comfortable with what they're selling, perhaps. And do leap in if you don't agree, John. And so sometimes the idea of doing an off-market deal with what will typically be, maybe an institutional buyer or someone who owns multiple forests, they feel there's an imbalance in sophistication, so they're a little worried to do an off-market deal. In terms of land, a lot more of that gets done off-market, often motivated by a desire for privacy from the seller who is, exiting a community as well as an asset.
The only thing I was going to add was just on the natural capital. I think we've a lot of it's around language and how that's changed over periods of time. And when I first started, we used to talk about amenity and conservation. Nothing's changed apart from the language. Some institutional bodies have tried to monetarize that natural capital. How do we get these things to pay? Carbon credits is an element of that. But I think it's just wise just to dwell on that thought that, how do you value or pay for a view? If you take a commercial forest in an attractive area, is it worth more than the same property in an unattractive place? Natural capital. So these very fine items come into play. And just on the off-market, yes, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of reasons why if you are running a commercial business, you might want to sell something off-market and just keep out of the limelight. Others are very keen to push out there and put it out as wide as possible. Both can work very well.
Thank you. Any more questions? Plenty. We'll take one back at the front and then one right at the front here. Thank you.
Tree diseases. Ips typographus has had a dramatic impact on Central European commercial spruce forests, and it's now present in the south of England. Would you like to comment on the risk that may pose to the rest of the country's forests?
One for you, Stuart. You can start with that.
It has a real potential, and we're all keeping a very keen eye on what it does. I touched on it in my paper. The southeast of England, the spruce down there, was at the limits of where it was comfortable to be growing. A lot of the spruce was kind of remnants of old Christmas tree crops that had been left, and a bit of old nurse crop that should have been taken out. So, and it was coming under increasing stress. So the Ips outbreak, perhaps into surprise, given its proximity to Northern Europe. Will it move further north? Potentially. But as I said, the Sitka plantations are growing in often growing in the healthiest place for them. Good, healthy crops. They are not under the same stressors. So, yes, we have to be vigilant. Yes, we do have to be clearing, trying to create a buffer between Ips and the main productive forests further north and west. So, no, we can't be complacent. But I'm more relaxed about Sitka's ability to resist a devastating attack than, say, the pockets of spruce down in the east of England.
Just to add to that, very good question and nice answer, is just that Forest Research is doing a lot of work on this, not surprisingly. Firstly, to see whether Ips colonises Sitka, which it appears to do so. and also to do some modelling to see how easy it will spread to other parts of the country based on climatic variables and other factors. So I don't want to give a sort of definitive answer on the chances of it being a problem in Scotland, but there is a lot of nice work being done on this. And I think actually Scottish Forestry have hosted an ICF presentation. I think it was today even, this morning. So that would be recorded. That was open to everyone. So there'll be a recording of that, which will include Max Blake from Forest Research, who will have given a summary on that very question, I should think. So do try and track down that recording.
Yeah, just to flag, actually, I'd encourage people to listen to that. It's part of the knowledge exchange aspect of the resilience work, high priority work that Scottish Forestry is taking forward, and this is a key one on bark beetles. So there's a couple of people from Europe that are talking. Max Blake, as David already mentioned, is talking, and really to give you the latest update on bark beetles and potential impacts. There's no doubt that IPS, is a potential future, current and future threat that we all need to be aware of and think quite seriously about. And our tree health team are obviously actively involved in the surveillance and monitoring of that pest. And it's something that they will be continuing to monitor very closely into the future and consider the level of risk that presents. So I think something to all actively keep an eye on and what direction that takes. Thanks.
Xander, you want more, do you? Oh, yeah.
At the risk of humiliating myself surrounded by foresters, can we talk a little about the mechanism? Because my layman's understanding is that the tree's defense against bark beetles is sap, and the tree's ability to produce sap is dependent on it getting sufficient water. And so it's quite drought dependent. Is that a reasonable simplification, or can someone...
Sorry, I wish I could answer that. I think definitely have a look at that video that Helen's just mentioned, because I think that will provide some of the answers.
Okay, thank you. Can I have the microphone up the front here? Harry, you weren't your controversial question, are you? You're right up the front here, please. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Robbie McDonald from Scotwood McDonald. A lot you might know me, but we do a lot of volume and yield class assessments, and I was really interested that yield class comes up, or productivity comes up a lot in the valuations and in future thinking of what we're going to plant. I suppose my question is kind of twofold. How much trust is currently put in the yield class assessments going forward? I know a lot of people build models on those. And how much research is going into those models to test whether they're still accurate, are they being updated regularly, and what's the future of that sort of yield class model?
Dr. David?
I'll try and answer that. Just what I can say is, for the project that I've been describing, there was a very thorough debate about what yield class to assign to each of these species, because it is pretty difficult to generalize across all sites. And what we didn't want to do was just provide an average figure for the whole country, because it depends on where you grow it, and you should really be assessing it for the areas where you're likely to grow it. So that was quite a difficult subjective thing to do. I think one of the problems is we don't have the growth models for all species. We only have them for a certain number of species. And that means for some of the species further down the list, we were using proxies. You say that its growth is similar to Norway spruce, for example. And so I think there is quite a bit more work that needs to be done around that to sort of really assess how some of these lesser-known species are performing. But that's the best I can do myself without referring you to my colleagues in FR. Thank you.
It doesn't necessarily answer your question, Robbie, but it is imperative that owners and managers know the volumes of timber that are standing on their land. We are carrying out valuations on a daily basis, and unless the base information is accurate and present, we're not going to go and turn around and do a full tariff survey of a forest before we're able to value it. I'm aware of some foresters, every time they go into a forest, they do a little bit more timber measuring on each visit and put together a plan of their whole forest over a period. Fantastic. We need that information flow to be able to accurately value things and sell them well.
So we've got 5 minutes left then for killer questions. There's one on the right-hand side. Nobody's spoken on the right-hand side, so.
Hi. Just a question around, I guess if you can look forward a year, fast forward to the 2025 Forest Market Report, when we've seen some transactions post-budget. A question for Xander and John, really. What do you think the impact is going to be of the changes in the most recent budget on IHT in particular?
For IHT?
From IHT. I mean, I was looking forward to the 1 month of the year that I don't think about the Forest Market Report coming up, but I don't think we've seen enough since the budget to have any kind of concrete evidence. John might have kind of stronger views than that, but I will say that it's largely been shrugged off, right? There's plenty of organizations that own forests that don't pay tax, charity, for example. And if you're an international buyer, this is all fairly meaningless to you. And forestry is it's Steve, who I can't see somewhere in the audience, on the Till Hill side. He summed it up best that you're worse off than you were before, but relatively you're actually possibly better off because you're still equal with farmland, and you're better than AIM shares.
Maybe, Mark, you might be able to answer the question as to when somebody becomes a high net worth individual, but clearly you get to a certain amount of wealth and a certain age when you are diversifying investments. You might be right at the end and suddenly worried about inheritance tax. Tax comes and goes. I don't believe personally, and as I say, hindsight's perfect vision, which we haven't got the benefit of just yet, but I don't believe we're going to see an additional amount of land. Bits and pieces, maybe. Farmers are pretty resilient. If you put together the marriage allowance, I think we get to about 3 million. Will we see those high net worth individuals with forestry sell more, buy more? You could argue that everyone who is a wealthy, high net worth individual should have at least £1 million worth of forestry. Do they put £1 million into some funds? Do they go off and buy their own forest? I think it may bring in some more money into the industry. What will that do to pricing? If it's a small movement, it may nudge it up a bit. But I think we get back to the fundamentals time and time again, rather than taxation, or that it's about demand and supply, timber price, and where that takes us, and demand for timber.
The only thing I would add is it is a year and a half before it kicks in, so there's a lot could happen in that time. Maybe they'll put it in the bank instead, which might not be a bad idea. Questions at the front, right, the very front. Then Harry, you can do your last one at the end.
The industry hasn't been mentioned much here, but timber security is probably one of the greatest concerns. And if you look at timber, if we don't have it, industry won't invest. And we've seen the first decline in the productive forest area from the National Forest Inventory, the last report. We're seeing windblow where windblow hasn't been cleared up. And more critically, the climate effects we're seeing are affecting countries which produce large volumes of timber that we import into the UK. Unless I'm very much mistaken, when you grow timber, if crops are productive, they absorb carbon, And that carbon is most often put into materials for construction, for pallets, and even for fencing, where it's stored for 15 to 100 years in construction or more. And that's the most important thing in climate change, is that we absorb carbon. So that's got to be the best thing. Does the panel think that we're heading in the right direction in advising the government whether we should take a risk on growing commercial crops, or just let things wither and die and look at 100-year solutions to carbon sequestration through peat, through long rotation broadleafs, where we don't know where we'll be in 100 years' time, rather than taking a risk on high production commercial crops that support the industry that will invest in the UK in the next 5 to 10 years to keep the values up. And I know, John, if timber short prices will go up, as a timber merchant, that's good news too, but is it good news for the country and in development and everything?
So that's quite a difficult question, quite a political question. Got a volunteer? Go for it, Helen.
So, just to highlight one aspect that has been used to advise government and ministers on productive forestry, and that is a report which hopefully a lot of you will be aware of, a research that we commissioned, which is called, I think, Quantifying the Forest Carbon Resource. And what that does is it looks at, it was done about 2 years ago and commissioned before that. It was a long time in the thinking, but it looks across the entire forest cycle. So it looks right from the start to the end product. It was done by a guy called Robert Matthews, which many of you will be aware of. And it comes out, looks at different woodland types and forest types, and the amount of carbon that is absorbed and stored at different points in the forest cycle. And it's a really, really fantastic study, and it does show the differences between productive conifer, between natives, between productive broadleaves, and it does clearly, you know, present the case for fast-growing conifer in that respect, in terms of the value of carbon and absorbing carbon. Of course, there's always the balance, and we need to strike that balance in terms of what we plant and what it delivers and the benefit it delivers to society. But just to point out that that is a key thing that was commissioned, which does support industry and point out the benefits of carbon in terms of for the productive side of the industry, notwithstanding that I mentioned, you know, it's all about there's balance in these things.
Maybe next year's Andy, we should have a politician or somebody from the government on the panel.
I mean, it is a challenge. You know, you mention productive commercial forestry to the average person in the street, and they recoil in terror. But they don't realise what it is they're recoiling in terror about. You know, having probably just spent the weekend in Centre Park cycling around some beautiful conifer forests, and you know, enjoying the delights of the red squirrel reserves. You know, we do have a challenge, and Stuart at the front there campaigns long and hard on the industry's behalf to try and get the public's perception and politicians' awareness of what we do need. And a good quality productive forest can do many things, but it certainly can produce timber, and we have the real opportunity with breeding programs, Sitka, to increase the yields on a decreased single species area. We touched on the yield models. We do know they're grossly inaccurate for the next generation of Sitka, shall we call it, and there is a campaign to get those tables released. I think they sit with our colleagues in research, not yourselves, I don't think, to be released, and it would be quite useful to have those to model the future potential of those forests. But no, it's a real challenge, and timber, you know, people think those beautiful bluebell woodlands are where our timber comes from, and that's a real issue we've got. How we get over that, I've been trying my career to do so. But
brilliant, thank you. Okay, last question, just front. Thank you.
Thanks. I should probably declare an interest ahead of this one. We're the owners of and developers of Stobo, which some of you might be aware has recently been the subject of Forestry Scot conceding that they have failed or erred in producing our no EIA required planting consent. So that one is now out of the list of stuff that was in the planting target or the planting achievement of Scotland this year, which is the first year it's actually hit its planting target in a long time. It's taking about 3 years to get from acquisition of site to consent. So if you look at what is being planted now, that effectively reflects where we were 3 years ago, peak of the market, ahead of the Woodland Carbon Code change, the Land Commission report, and very definitely the inflection point on land pricing. Really one, I think, for John and Zander, but if you look how important it is from a climate change perspective for the country as a whole to meet its planting targets, which we've still failed to do now this year. If you look at the amount of land that's transacting now and your view on what that's looking like going forward, yeah, what's your outlook or the likelihood of hitting those targets going forward? And are we being realistic about that?
John, you can go first.
Extremely slim.
Zander?
Yeah, I mean, it's not enough, and Stuart and I reached for the mic on the last question at the same time, and I was going to say something similar, that we're not doing enough because people don't like it, right? And people don't like it probably because they don't understand it. Farmers don't like it because they feel it puts them out of business. But it was obvious from that research that Helen mentioned that commercial forestry is a really good way, probably the best way of sequestering carbon. But it's figuring out how to connect that to people's lives. And I tried to sow some seeds with big social housing developers to say, hey, you know, we've got 3 issues with housing costs, right? It's the land cost, which potentially the tax changes could have an impact on. We've got the cost of materials, which, you know, growing more timber could have an impact on. And we've got the cost of labor, which if we switched to something like CLT, which requires a lot less labor on site, that could help with that as well. Now, the current government's policy on housing seems to be trying to spur private sector growth, but I don't see how you can kind of square that circle with the private sector. You know, either you throw money at people through Help to Buy and things like that, but it just pushes prices up. They can't control interest rates because that's independent. So, you know, one thing that they can do is actually, you know, put some money into building more social housing. It'll ease pressure on the rental market, which is where people are really getting squeezed, which then again eases pressure on the housing market. And we learned last year from the guys talking about fire regulations for timber buildings in the UK that as long as you're not building super tall buildings, which isn't the best way to achieve density anyway, actually something like Islington is the best way to achieve density, which was described as skyscrapers on their side. You can build timber-framed buildings, right? So then we can start talking about, well, where's this timber coming from? Well, it's coming from spruce plantations in the UK as well. It's also creating value, it's sequestering carbon and creating jobs in the rural space. So that shift politically, I think, is possibly what's required to kind of solve a lot of these problems and actually lead us to achieve some planting targets, which at the moment are just madness.
I'd like to hear from some of the managers in the room as to the average length it takes to get a planting application through. I know we are dealing with changing a landscape potentially forever, and it's a very important subject, and we must get it right. But time and time and time again, I hear of applications that take 18 months up to 3 years, and it appears that our friends at Scottish Forestry may have not got that one wrong. Personally, that length of time is not acceptable. If the scheme's not right for the land, then let's get it over and done with and move on to the next one. But the time taken to get some of these schemes through, to me, seems quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have a statutory process, and that's right and proper, but what the statutory process lacks is defined boundaries, and time is one of them. You know, if you're building a house, the planning process has defined boundaries of time and process and appeal. With a forest, it's a free-for-all, and everybody is invited to come into that free-for-all, whether they have valid views or not. And the process then is not managed through a time-bound statutory process, and that's what we need. Otherwise, instead of months, it takes years, and before long, we are going to be into half a decade to get a scheme through. I can see it coming, and just layering up with bureaucratic paperwork. Just because you can't see over the papers doesn't mean you actually done a good job of the process.
I think I'll say something really quick, Will, and then we'll come to you. So we have a status quo-based planning system in the UK, right? It's there to protect what is there, right? And every piece of land will have some value to somebody or some use case. And there's nobody taking a big picture view of saying, we need, X amount of different things somewhere. Where's the least worst place for it to go? Instead of, it's just site by site Lord of the Flies. And each time that forestry gets knocked back, there's not, nothing happens, right? It's just that we can then get knocked back again and again in the future. And that's how the targets are failed to be achieved. Sorry, Will, I think you had a...
No, hi, thank you. No, I was just going to add to that. Will Johnson, Gresham House, we invest in existing forestry and new forestry sites across the UK. We're speaking with a lot of investors at the moment looking to deploy capital into this natural capital sphere that John has talked about. And I think, we're really at a point now where the role of private finance in accelerating progress on these afforestation targets needs to change. There will always be a place for the investment-led freehold acquisition model of buying a site and developing, and I agree that the timeframes are long, but we have to follow the process, and it's important, therefore, that we identify the right sites and conduct that due diligence pre-acquisition where we can. But increasingly, I feel personally, not necessarily a Gresham view, that where the role of private capital is to scale in existing landowners to contributing portions of their land holding for afforestation in a more integrated way within a landscape context, so that we can start to ameliorate those community concerns and the community impact, and also provide greater ecological gain, but crucially support the production of sustainable timber and fibre. And that message really resonates with investors looking to put capital to work in the UK landscape. Is on a risk-adjusted basis, they see the role of timber very much front and centre, underpinning that investment, and sort of dipping a toe and exploring those other benefits through carbon as the risk starts to reduce and we start pulling out of that sort of trough in the optimism on the carbon market. No specific question, but I just thought I'd add that.
Well, I think I'll draw it to an end. So that talks about the problems in the sector, and we're not shying away from those, but we've also heard about the opportunities. We're not planting enough trees, and there's a great demand for it, both for construction, but also for the environment. So on that theme, thank you all for coming along today. Those online, thank you for joining us. Lunch is served about there. The panel are around to answer questions over lunch. And if you want, you can come back and do it again tomorrow in London. Thank you all very much.